Okay, welcome everybody. I hope you're enjoying your day at JuiceIT 2018. Welcome to our education session, our education panel session around security. So this session came about by a number of you and a number of our other education customers approaching us around concerns or wanting to understand more around the mandatory breach legislation that's recently come into effect and the effect that that has on privacy and so forth. So we thought it'd be a great idea to have a session while we've got a group of you here from the industry to further that discussion in an informal setting. And so I'll get started with the introductions. So first of all, on the far left, we've got our facilitator, Richard Dornhart, who manages our security practice nationally for Data3. We've then got Alex Hutchins, who's a partner at McCulloch Robinson Lawyers, and we've been doing some work with Alex around helping our customers better understand their legal obligations when it comes to this particular subject. We've then got Logan Daly. Logan's a senior consultant in our security team at Data3, and Logan's been doing some work with some of our education customers quite recently. We've then got Paul Green, who is a senior consultant specialising in security at Business Aspect, and Richard Humphreys, and many of you would know Richard as the IT manager at TSS on the Gold Coast. So I'd also like to welcome one of our key vendor partners in the education space around security, and that's Palo Alto. So Mauricio and the team are in the crowd today to contribute to the conversation as well. So welcome, Mauricio. Now, the format today is that Richard is going to ask each of the panel members an initial question to get the conversation started, and then we're going to open up for the rest of the session for a general discussion. And we invite you to engage and ask those questions that you'd like answered.
I'm quite excited about this. So it's a great opportunity, and I think mandatory breach is something that we've all been hearing a lot about over the last 24 months, really, and it's amazing how quickly time flies. So here we are, February 22nd's come and gone. I saw some statistics just recently on mandatory breach, and I guess how many organizations have already notified, and 63. So in the first quarter, there's been 63, and one of the statistics that I found interesting about that was the top industries in the sector. The top one was health service providers, but number 4 was education. So there's obviously a lot of onus being put on. A lot of people are thinking about this. And so, Alex, it'd be great just to start with you and talking about, I got a 2-part question for you, actually. So what are the legal obligations for organizations under the mandatory breach notification laws? And are there any particular areas that schools or education institutions should be focused on when thinking about that?
Yeah, sure. So look, this is very important to understand as kind of a threshold issue. What do you have to notify and what do you not have to notify? Richard said, well, we've got going at a run rate of 63. I saw a stat the first 30 days, there were 31 notifications. So we're going at one a day ish. But a lot of the inquiries I've had relate to, well, we've had this data breach, let's go notify now. And my response is actually, well, no, you don't have to notify that. Just calm down.
Yep.
You've got a security problem, but you don't have a privacy problem. So the data breach notification laws are under the Privacy Act, the Commonwealth Privacy Act, and that covers personal information, which is information basically which identifies someone or could reasonably use to identify someone. So if you've got 2 bits of information that together can identify someone, then each of them is a bit of personal information. So the question is, and there's sort of a 2-limb test to be satisfied. Is there an unauthorised access or disclosure of information where a reasonable person would think that that access or disclosure is likely to lead to serious harm? So there's a few elements of that, but really serious harm is defined as being harm that is economic, reputational, physical, emotional, and then a laundry list of others, plus any other harm you can think of. So is there definitely information that has got out or has been accessed where harm is likely to follow from that? And likely just means more probable than not. The second limb is, has there been loss of information where if it were accessed in an unauthorised way, that access would lead to reasonable harm? So you've got a situation where you know that information is in the wrong hands, or you know you've lost it, and the circumstances in which you've lost it mean it's likely that it could be in the wrong hands. So if you leave a laptop on a train or a USB stick in a fairly public place, then you can think, well, it's likely that someone's going to get their hands on that, and it's probably likely that they'll then look into it, and then you do this analysis about whether harm follows. So that's the obligation now. Is there definitely been a breach, or have you lost something and now you don't know what's going to happen to it? But if someone gets their hands on it, there's a breach. And once you step through that threshold, then the question is, okay, I've got to notify the Privacy Commissioner and I've got to notify affected individuals. And there's specific things that you have to put in those notices, and there's a time frame. So you've got to do it within 30 days, effectively. So 30 days of finding out about it. So there's quite a strict time frame to meet. It's not as bad as Europe. Europe's got some similar laws coming into effect in the middle of May, which give you 72 hours to notify. But 30 days is not a lot of time if you're scrabbling around trying to work out if your systems have been hacked and what information's got out, and the newspapers are calling you asking for comment and all of those sorts of things. So it's a pressure cooker situation, and so 30 days will go past pretty quickly. So look, that's what we're talking about, and particularly in the context of education, you're dealing with information about students and potentially staff, and it can be quite sensitive. So it is the sort of information that will definitely have to be notified if there's a breach. So that's sort of the framework now that we're working in. And the final point to note, I think, is if you don't notify, then the maximum penalty for failing to notify is $2.1 million. So it's not straight to 2.1 million. There's a range of factors and a range of other things that the Privacy Commissioner can do in terms of enforcement, but that's the headline scary number that has got everyone's attention now. And to answer the second part of your question, really, what should the education sector be looking at? Really, to understand this, I don't think the education sector is different from many of the other sectors we advise. The point is really to understand your data. So it's knowing what your environment is and what sits in it. So the first thing we say to clients is, well, do you use third-party service providers? Do you store things in the cloud? Do you have hosted solutions? Do you have a help desk that call a third-party help desk? Do you have third-party service providers doing IT support for your students on site? Understand how many players there are in your environment, and particularly your IT environment, and what data you hold and where you hold it. You'd be surprised how many departments and teachers will have their own secret database of this, that, and the other. And if you don't understand where things sit and what sits there, then it's really hard to plan for having to notify if that's compromised. So understanding what you've got, reviewing your environment and the data that you hold is absolutely the most important thing to do. It's like a step backwards before you can plan for responding to a breach. You need to know where you are today.
Gaining visibility, having the appropriate policy around the information. I think what's interesting in what you're saying was we often don't think about something as simple as a lost laptop could potentially be something that you would have to notify on. We were giving a presentation to clients, and one of the questions from the floor was, we have heard it debated whether you're actually allowed to send an email anymore, because if that email's got a name in it, that's personal information. It's in the hands of someone else,
Right.
And if they misuse it, that could lead to harm. So, that's not the case. Email is not dead, and we all agreed in the room that we can keep emailing each other. But the point is that the ways in which personal information can get out are really often more simple than you think. So it is losing devices, leaving devices behind. It's not just massive cyber attacks that have managed to get through your firewall somewhere. It can be, you've got students' papers in a folder that you've got to mark, and you leave them behind somewhere. I had a colleague once who left some very sensitive documents in a bar on a Friday night that she was taking home to work on over the weekend. But it's as simple as leaving a bag somewhere and you don't know where that is anymore. And so you're probably then into that situation where you've lost information, you don't know where it is, but if someone gets their hand on it, it's going to be serious. So you've got to notify that. So really, it's really simple
Yep.
to trigger this in ways you wouldn't think.
It's kind of a great segue into my next question for Paul, which is, in your experience, how is the education sector managing information risk to meet the mandatory breach requirements?
So what we're seeing is that much of the education sector has been unprepared in this kind of environment. It's not information security has not normally been top of mind, and it's been a best efforts approach as lots of new systems and tools have come into place. Security, it's been more about helping the classroom, help the administration, and the security has kind of always been an afterthought. So, but most organisations we're dealing with are starting to get on top of that. They're starting to have people that are responsible for at least reviewing the security and making sure that it is being looked at. Some of the organisations that we've been working with more recently are starting to also look at things like a data breach, so they're trying to want to understand what information they've got. So we're doing things like assessing the organisation as a whole, looking at where information is stored, what type of information is being stored, who has access to that information, and who's responsible for it. I think what was mentioned earlier is teachers in many cases collecting information, and because of some of the processes that have been involved in, they're retaining that locally because it's easier to access rather than having to go back through other systems. So it's coming around to some of that understanding, assessing, education, helping organisations develop some policies, procedures, actually taking some existing processes and maybe updating them, making them simpler to be for the users and the business to actually maintain.
It's about really the organization starting to understand what information they hold, what's the potential value of that information, and then starting to build policy. I know that in a lot of my experiences dealing with education organizations, there's now questions about help us understand where our unstructured data is, what that information, how it's being accessed, how it's being used, and then we can start developing policies and procedures around how to better store it, how to better manage it, how to manage the incoming and outgoing and all of that. And I think it leads quite nicely into, Logan, from your perspective, I know that you're outperforming security assessments and vulnerability assessments across government and education all the time. And we often get the opportunity to sit down and talk about some of the gaps and areas of risk that you're uncovering. It'd be great if maybe, love to hear about some of that and what you're seeing.
I think what's probably most interesting is just the commonalities you're finding across all sectors, regardless of how big they are. It could be a small school, could be a large government department, could be private enterprise. It doesn't really matter, but a lot of it seems to come down to things that aren't traditionally technical. And one of the big things that tends to jump out is kind of the mindset and the culture around the office, because I generally will take a bit of a liberal walk around the office to see how people are interacting with the technology. And sometimes I'll see telecommunications rooms with doors propped open for whatever reason because they happen to keep photocopy paper in there. Or somebody will get up and walk away from their computer without locking it for hours upon hours, and if there's no one else in that office, it gives ample opportunity to get in. You might think there might be stuff like, say, Post-it notes written on or passwords written on Post-it notes, which I certainly do find, but you do find confidential documentation left out. So not every security challenge can necessarily be solved by technology, and I think that's one of the gaps that has to be overcome. The other one is just that a lot of people think that security, cybersecurity specifically, is a technical issue, and ergo it's going to be an IT department issue. Whereas really it's a risk problem and that's a business problem. And when I say business, I mean I'm obviously talking about the organization as a whole. So there is a bit of that mindset that, oh no, IT will handle it, it's IT's problem, we'll just give IT some more money, they'll go out and they'll buy this shiny box with flashing lights and it'll fix all of our problems. When it could be further from the truth. It's more about what you actually do with it and how you actually use it, because I think technology in and of itself, believe it or not, is perfect because it does exactly what we tell it to do. And if we tell it to do the wrong thing, it's going to do the wrong thing. And then when people say, well, it's not working, the person only has to look at themselves first. Another thing is just the kind of the administrative and the enforcement side of things, where a lot of organizations will have the policies and the procedures and it looks great on paper and they've signed off on it, but they don't necessarily enforce it. So they don't educate the masses as to say, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, and if you do the wrong thing, these are the consequences as a result. You tend to find people sharing login information, which is kind of like saying, no, you're not supposed to do that. Don't share your login credentials, or they'll use generic accounts. But there's a whole different number of ways that people tend to get around the systems. So I think a lot of the conversations need to be risk-based, and they also need to focus on the mindset and the culture. And that's not going to come overnight, and it's not going to happen immediately. It'll take literally years to kind of change that mindset of an organization, to kind of adapt to the way that the information needs to be handled. So I know Alex had alluded to the fact about paperwork being left out, and a prime example was this filing cabinet from the ABC that went missing. You know, there's certainly no firewall or endpoint protection package or anything like that that would have ever solved that problem. And to prove a point about physical security, a number of years ago I did an engagement in Canada for an organization that waxed poetic about this wonderful firewall they had just spent $500,000 implementing. Well, I dressed up like a Sparky, made some forged credentials, and I convinced the maintenance guy to let me into a room, whereupon I unbolted the firewall, put it onto a trolley, rolled it out, put it into my car, then proceeded to ring the CEO and asked him how his new firewall was working. At no point in time was I pulled up either physically, and there were certainly no technical controls that were going to prevent that sort of thing from happening. So it's kind of thinking outside of the technical sphere. So it's all about kind of having that, you know, I need to think of my technology, but how do I control it, and how do I access it, and how do I use it, sort of thing. And the good takeaway from a lot of it is that people are willing to change. They're willing to say, hey, we've got a problem, we need visibility, can you help us know what we don't know? And that's what these assessments that we've been doing are.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting, and especially around the education piece, where the cyber education training has been taking on a life of its own.
Absolutely. And so again, good lead into, I guess, the star of the video, Richard, who,
Well,
and I think because you've got the practical application of a lot of what we've been talking about, Richard.
yeah, I think it's all been pretty much covered.
Yeah, what you've been talking about. I mean,
everything that's been said is exactly what we're seeing, and I'm sure a lot of schools here are seeing in their environments. Like, with, you know, you can engineer as many solutions as you want, but it's funny you just mentioned you know, access to the data center. Like, we have 2 data centers, and we have a proximity lock system. I'm sure a lot of schools are, you know, they love these little proximity lock systems because they've had the old traditional master key that every student has, especially in a 100-year-old boarding school. I think more kids have master keys than the staff did. So they started rolling out proximity locks, and we built this brand new multi-purpose hall. It's only just been built. It's only just came online this year. Walked into our new disaster recovery centre, and lo and behold, there's a cleaning trolley in there. Like, well, how did the cleaning trolley get in there? You know, obviously we're not applying the restrictions we need around the physical security as well. So I was going to go start talking about, you know, our journey around technology, and obviously looking at you know, all the wireless and new technology we put in Palo Alto and all that. But you know, I think I've spoken about that at ISQ, and I'm happy to answer lots of questions about that. And it's been really, really good. But yeah, like, I actually got some stats here. We did a phishing campaign against our staff, right? Which I highly recommend. It was really eye-opening. Like, we've done a lot of work around our security. We ran a phishing campaign at the end of the year. 298 emails went out. 174 of them were opened. 96 of them clicked the link.
Nice.
And 64 of them all provided their credentials, their school credentials, right? So, and I thought we were going to play our little Simpsons video, which was, I don't know, did that get pulled? But basically it's the Simpsons video showing that, you know, the burns, and they're walking through all the security and the facial recognition and everything, but then the back door's hanging off by a hinge, right? And I think, yeah, what you're saying is actually rings completely true. And so I actually presented that to staff, and they were shocked. They were really shocked. And, you know, I think it is, you know, you really need to get that message out there. And it is difficult, like, you know, trying to get in front of the staff on a more regular basis to try and get that message across. But yeah.
it's my wife's a teacher, and so she leaves the front door open when she leaves the house.
Yeah.
So I mean, the fact, I hope nobody knows where I live. The actual fact is that she's more concerned with educating kids than she is with locking doors, and I think that's the challenge we have as teachers. That's what that's their ultimate concern. So, well, I think we're getting short on time. It's amazing how quickly time flies. I just wanted to open up. If there's any questions for the panel here to anybody in the room? And I've already asked 4, so I can't ask another one. Yep.
Yes. Yeah. I think that the definitely, the younger teachers that are coming through are a little bit more aware, and some of the older teachers are a little bit unaware. But sharing passwords, someone mentioned it. Yeah, you wouldn't think it would happen, but it happens. It's incredible. Yeah. So we've sort of had to increase all our password complexity rules and refreshing passwords more often. I think we were going to set our password lockout at 3. We had to extend that to 5. It is education, right? So they are academics. But I think visibility is a huge thing. I think I was going to actually ask a question around the breach notifications. So I luckily, thank God, touch wood, I haven't had to be involved in anything like that yet. But if I was to have to report, I wonder what information they're going to request from me and how much visibility I really have on that breach. Do you have any idea what they may or may not ask for?
The commissioner?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a list of things that you have to tell them about the breach, including the recommended steps for curing the breach, so people can take self-help steps to cancel their bank account or change their password. What it's likely to do is trigger an investigation into your broader privacy practices. So it's not a crime to be hacked. So you may be hacked and have to notify that this breach occurred, but then the Privacy Commissioner thinks, well, I'll have a look since we're here. We'll have a look around, and then it gets into a broader question about, well, what are your policies? Do you have password reset policies?
Right.
And behaviourally, are they enforced, or is it just, like you say, a beautiful document that no one's ever used other than to maybe keep the door open? So it is that behavioural thing. So it's more likely that you'll then be in a circumstance where your broader privacy practices are under the microscope, and that's more than an IT question. That is a cultural question, a behavioural question.
I just want to add to that. The biggest, the one thing that in the IT world it impacted your incident response plan. But the one thing that you get different with the data breaches, you've got an external party, the Office of Information Commissioner, but you've also got the people that got breached that you've got to notify. So there's a difference in communication. So your IT incident plan would have been very internal. So you need to make sure that you've got a way and you know who's going to be responsible for making those communications. And it may not be the IT department at all. You may just feed that information to someone else, who then goes out and feeds it to the wider community. So and it's just making sure that that's documented, because otherwise you end up with different communications going in different areas, and then everyone getting blurred about what the actual thing was, and maybe people giving information out that you didn't want the public to know about and things. So it's making sure it's all documented in the plans.
Another question there in the back. Yep. Start with Richard and then go to Paul. Yeah.
As much money as I can get my hands on, right? It's education. I had a whole bunch of notes I was going to talk about, but dealing obviously with Data 3 helps because you do have access to resources that are really knowledgeable in the area. And that helps you spend the money wisely, because we can waste hundreds of thousands of dollars on solutions that may or may not work. And probably one thing that I get a lot of benefit out of is talking to other schools, and talking to them about what worked for them, what didn't work for them. And I've always been really quite lucky that everything I put in has actually worked really well. and I haven't wasted a lot of money. My budget's really fixed, and it's all OpEx, and it's all on a rolling lease, so that we make a decision, and that's a decision set for 3 to 4, 5 years until we can then refresh that technology. So, to answer your question, what do we spend on it? Yeah, as much as we can. I think as someone else mentioned this earlier, it's never really been a huge priority. I don't know about other schools, but security has been one of those things that's been around. It's been a necessity to have some sort of security, but it's really we're really still starting to really need to focus on it. And I can definitely see a shift in the TSS IT budget and putting it more around security and value add. And running phishing attacks and pen tests are just really invaluable information. And it was shocking. I was surprised. I didn't think we'd get that many, but it was. We even had. I got another stat here. We had this really, really obvious one. Win an iPad. We had 12 people provide their credentials for that. So that's pretty scary. You only need one of those, and it's game over. So.
Paul, did you have?
I was just going to say it's a risk and reward. So it's identifying what the risk of losing the information. If you lose personal information, it could be as high as 2.1 million. And obviously reputational damage, etc. beyond that. So it's then identifying what are the appropriate controls I can put in place. And some controls like education, procedures, policies and things like that haven't got a huge expense. It's more time and resource. And then you've got your technical controls like your firewalls and the other configurations, which are more expensive and bigger investments. That's just making sure and that's where the assessment comes in at the beginning, understanding what you've got to protect, how you're going to protect it.
Yeah. So I think we've, yep.
On that particular subject, is it fair to say that leadership, there needs to be some education for leadership around understanding the risk in this space, so that they do have the appropriate budgets allocated to from a business or organisation perspective?
I think everybody here would say yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a resounding yes.
And there's just Google it. I mean, how many schools have been involved in privacy breaches and cyber attacks and ransomware attacks? It's in the news. And I know TSS, they love to find an article about TSS to put us in for the news for the wrong reasons. So it's important. Yeah.
And I mean, there were 63 breaches in the first quarter, and there were enough that it was highlighted as education was highlighted as one of the statistics in terms of that they were counting.
And it was private education too, I think.
So, for example, when I lose an iPhone, it's not as big a deal, even though most people say credentials and 10 use facial rec compared to losing a Windows device with an iPhone. Is that a difference?
Yeah. So just to be clear, there's not an absolute, if you lose a device, it's got to be notified. So you have to step through, is there a likelihood of serious harm? And the law being the law, there's always exceptions. So one of the key exceptions is you don't need to notify if there's no likelihood of serious harm. But equally, if you have implemented a technical solution in a way which means that you're satisfied there's no risk of serious harm. Now, what does that mean? In practice, it means if you have lost a fully encrypted device that is password protected and you can tell that it hasn't been accessed from, say, access logs, and then you can flick a kill switch. Like my work device has got Mimecast on it, and we can wipe a device remotely. So if my phone were on the train and we worked out that I'd lost it, we could wipe it remotely and we could work out if anyone had accessed it. And provided no one had accessed it, we'd say, well, there's nothing to notify. Equally, if a database is hacked, but you've got a crazy level of encryption on it, so you're very confident that that can't be reversed into meaningful data, then you might say there's no action. The technical solution is such that we don't need to notify. So you're absolutely right. To take your sort of Windows or Android versus Apple kind of analogy, you might think, well, the Apple device is likely to be more secure. You get locked out, it takes however long to hack into it. Part of your security posture might be to look at differential security across, someone who's got higher levels of permission and access might have some different password requirement or have to change it more frequently or something. You can start to look at applying not a one size fits all, but different rules based on risk. and device type and application and all those sorts of factors.
And it's also where you're beyond prevention, there's also detection, so and auditability. So if you can see whether someone's used that iPad to access the back-end system of the database and the data sets, if you're able to determine that and you know it hasn't happened and you know then you've wiped the device or disabled the access, then you can safely rest assured that your data hasn't been compromised. And if you know it has been compromised, then you're able to make sure you can follow all the data breach procedures.
But this is where that initial assessment of understanding what your environment is, so you can, for instance, encrypt all of your databases from day one. But if you're only finding out that marketing had this list or, a certain staff member had this list of every student who's ever been at the school, if you're only finding out that existed once that laptop's gone and you've never had a chance to encrypt it, you don't get a chance to take advantage of some of these self-help remedies. It's too late. So it goes back to the point that I think everyone has made in their own way, which is understanding your environment and your data is just invaluable. It's the most important step you can undertake.
Did you have a quick note? Any other? Okay.
I'm going to get everyone to sit next session on time. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you very much for the panel. Can we have a bit of a round of applause for the panel? Thanks, guys, for giving up your time. Alex has flown in from Sydney specifically for the session, so thank you, Alex. That was great. Look, Fabian's going to be at the door to hand out just some basic information on some of the assessments that we can provide. Logan's done some assessments in schools or been working with some schools around this space, so please ask some questions to him or any other members of the panel if you need to after the session. And we're available to help you, talking about that education piece with leadership, and that's one of the reasons we've partnered with McCulloch and Robinson, is because we feel from a legal standpoint that can maybe help you educate leadership around some of the risks involved with some of this stuff. So with that, thank you again very much for coming along and enjoy the rest of your day at Juice. Thank you.